DW Number 1, Draft 4.5. The Ocean Rider. Loiara held Thera's hands as she gazed into his eyes. Not another sound stirred as she sang. The ancient melodeon rolled smoothly off her tongue and echoed around the hall. It was a language as old as the worlds themselves, the musical tongue in which words and music blend together harmoniously to create meaning. Whilst not commonly used for conversation because of its complexity, it was still studied by some and often used for ceremonial occasions such as this. When she had finished, Thera then sang his part, his deep voice emitting the solemn yet joyous syllables of his pledge. Then there was silence. They stepped over to a small high table, which was laid out with implements. Loiara reached out her left hand palm upwards. Thera held it, and, taking a small, sharp knife from the table, he drew the blade carefully across her palm, making a shallow cut. Loiara turned her head aside and gritted her teeth as he did so. He then took a cloth dipped in ink, and gently dabbed it over the wound. With another cloth dampened with water, he wiped away the excess ink. Finally, he wrapped a light bandage around her hand. When this was complete, Thera held out his own left hand, and Loiara performed the same treatment on him. The elder stepped forward and spoke. "2 young individuals walked into this building today, but they shall not walk out again, for as we have all witnessed, they have sworn their oaths in the musical tongue, and they have marked each other's skin to show their commitment to one another. They have now become something far greater than either one was alone. Thera, Loiara, you arrived here today as 2 young individuals, but you shall leave as a man and his wife. May the years be kind to you and prosper you as you forge your new life together. May the fire of your love burn on, though all the fiercest storms of life endeavour to drive you apart. Thera, you may now kiss your bride." Applause broke out from around the room, and the new couple needed no further prompting. They smiled down at the assemblage, about 24 friends and relatives from town. Loiara particularly noted her own family, her father, Icon, and her younger brother, Rattle. Their mother had died when Rattle was just a baby. Even though Loiara was only 8 years old at the time, she had done her best to show Rattle the love and care most children receive from their mothers. That night there was a feast to celebrate the marriage, complete with tender roast chickens, succulent salads, and an enormous cake. And there were speeches and songs and dances and games until late into the night. Rattle was glad to see his sister so happy. She had not stopped smiling at all the entire day. Although the couple retired early in the evening, it was well past midnight by the time all the guests had at last gone home to their beds. Tarbaroch was a small town on the eastern coast of Khoranath. Although there was a small pier, the town's size and location did not encourage a lot of trading by sea. Most merchant ships did business at the cities of Kharam or Torakuri, further to the north. Tarbaroch was, however, home to quite a number of fishermen, including Icon. Various tradesmen and people of other professions worked in the town, and farmers tilled the fields further inland. Thera's uncle, Gorrel, was a carpenter, and Rattle had been training as his apprentice for over a year now. Gorrel was a well-built man, not as tall as some, with jet black hair and beard, gentle brown eyes, and of course the tough calloused hands of a tradesman. He had a keen eye for detail, a sharp wit, and a deep, hearty laugh. Rattle's hair was dark blonde, and usually rested in a rather unkempt sprawl about his ears. He was somewhat skinny, but not at all unfit, for he was usually quite active in his spare time. He showed the promise of filling out into a fine and capable young man. In every life there comes a point where one stops to wonder who he is, and what the future will hold for him. For Rattle, this happened one evening as he sat alone on a rock and stared out to sea. The last embers of twilight faded into the sky behind him, and a crescent moon began to peek out above the horizon. A gentle breeze wafted in from the ocean, but Rattle was impervious to its chill bite, for he was warmly dressed and had other things on his mind. Already it was 4 months since the wedding. Rattle wondered whether he would have a family of his own one day, and what that would be like. He wondered whether he would always be a carpenter, as he was being trained to be, or whether he would decide on some other trade. He wondered what lay beyond Tarbaroch. In all the 16 years of his life, he had never been beyond its outskirts. What were other places like? What were the cities like? Would he ever visit them? Perhaps he would live somewhere else one day. The future was a great big unknown, just like the ocean spread out before him. It was exciting to imagine the possibilities, yet terrifying to think just how they would really turn out. He blinked back the stray tear that was trying to escape from the corner of his eye, then got up and headed for home. The Ocean Rider was not a huge ship. She was a two-masted schooner, but nevertheless she was a sturdy craft at sea. She was owned by a merchant trader from Charom, who was preparing to set sail to the southeast on a trade route. He stopped by Tabarok to hire a few more crew members, as he had just bought a full cargo of goods and couldn't afford to pay some of the more experienced sailors from the city. Having quite a good deal of nautical knowledge from his fishing trade, Icon decided to join the voyage, as the wages offered were quite satisfactory. A handful of other men from town also signed up, providing the captain with a good-sized crew. The Ocean Rider was due to set sail just after dawn. Rattle was up just as the first glimpse of morning twilight began to make an appearance on the horizon. He ran down to the dock, his bare feet squeaking in the dry sand as he crossed the beach. His left ankle got tangled in a clump of seaweed left on the shore by the ebbing tide, and he hopped on his right foot as he vigorously shook it off. The morning air was very still, the sea flat as a lake, barely lapping upon the sand. Several tiny crabs scuttled for shelter as Rattle came galloping past. The sailors were already busy, making last-minute preparations for the voyage, loading supplies and clambering about in the rigging, checking the sails and adjusting the plethora of ropes that controlled them. The captain stood on the pier with the quartermaster discussing plans for the day regarding the navigation of the ship and the current weather situation. Rattle stood well out of the way as he watched them all scurrying about the vessel like ants on an old apple core. As the light grew and daybreak drew nearer, many other people emerged from their houses and came to watch the ship set sail, and to say a last farewell to their friends and family members who were leaving. It would be several months before they returned, although there were too many factors to give any precise estimate. Rattle cast his eyes back inland and saw Loyara coming down the beach. He ran to meet her. She was alone, as Thera had to work on the farm. "What a surprise to see you're here already," she said, sarcastically. They both smiled. "They are up before I was," he said, gesturing towards the swarm of sailors. "They're working like beavers. Who would think it could take so much work just to get one boat ready to sail?" "She's not a boat, she's a ship, a real honest ship." Vessels of any great size were a rare sight in Tabarok, and it was regarded as very exciting to even see one, particularly by the younger generation, and to have one docked at their own harbour for the whole week was a glorious treat. "She's certainly a beautiful vessel," Loyara remarked. "It must make Father proud to work on a ship like that. I hope he enjoys it." "I don't think there can be much doubt of that. It must be a great adventure." "I shall miss him a lot, though." A tear welled up in the corner of her eye, glistening in the rays of the rising sun. "I know I will. It'll be so strange not seeing him for so long. I suppose you'll get a bit lonely at home by yourself." "Oh no, didn't you hear? I'm going to be staying with Gorrel." "Ah, that's a fine arrangement. There'll be no escaping from your work then," she teased. "He says you're welcome to come and visit for dinner any time you feel like baking one of your quince pies." They both laughed. At last the ship was ready. Final farewells were made, with many hugs and tears all around. Then all the sailors climbed aboard. The mooring lines were cast off, the anchor hauled up, and the sails unfurled, hanging almost lifeless in the still air. Hopefully the breeze would pick up further out to sea. All the crew that could be spared hurried below to man the oars, protruding from oarports in the vessel's sides, and looking not unlike the legs of a great beetle crawling across the ocean's surface. Rattle ran to the end of the pier and waved his arms in the air as the Ocean Rider slowly shrank away into the distance. Before long it was naught but a grey smudge on the horizon, and soon after it was gone. Gone forever, it seemed. Rattle turned and headed back into town with a great weight on his heart. The next few months felt like some of the slowest of Rattle's life. He missed his father greatly. Even so, life was not dull. He continued to learn a lot at his work with Gorrel. He proved to be very skilled with his hands, and all the hard work was good exercise for his muscles. When he was not working, he still managed to keep himself occupied. He would often go fishing with some friends, or sometimes they would walk along the shore, or go exploring in the hills. On many evenings he would go and have dinner with Loyara and Thera, or sometimes they would come and visit him and Gorrel, and they never tired of devouring Loyara's delightful quince pies. But in spite of all the joy and happiness, Rattle longed for the day when his father returned. It was the custom in Horanath that when a young man turned 17 years old, there would be a ceremony in celebration of his coming of age. Rattle was quite excited when his own 17th birthday was just a week away, but he became overjoyed when he heard the news. A pigeon had flown into town, a carrier pigeon bearing a message. The Ocean Rider would return to Tarbaroch in just 4 days, more or less, depending on how the weather held. That would mean that Icon would be home in time for Rattle's birthday. The world couldn't be a happier place. Rattle awoke in the middle of the night to a sound. A booming roar of thunder. It was pitch dark outside, and heavy raindrops pelted the ground like a volley of arrows. The wind was howling like 100 packs of wolves on a hunt. A flash of light accompanying a jagged streak of lightning suddenly illuminated the world for a split second, and almost instantly there followed another deafening crash that seemed to shake the entire house. Rattle had to put his hands on his ears to protect them from the noise. Even inside, the air was damp. He knew there was no way he'd be able to get back to sleep for a long time. He decided to get up for a bit. He walked down to the kitchen and cut himself a slice of bread for a late-night snack. He sat and ate it, listening to the sounds of the storm outside. Another sound reached his ears. Gorrel's snoring. How anyone could sleep through such a racket was more than Rattle could fathom. After a long time, the storm gradually lessened. The rolls of thunder became less frequent and more distant, and the wind relaxed somewhat from its wild fury. The rain, though it still fell steadily and constantly, no longer hammered the ground and rooftops, but rather settled into a soft, drenching flow. Rattle was finally able to resume slumber. When at last he woke again, it was mid-morning. The rain had not abated any more, and the sunlight was dim through the thick blanket of clouds. Rattle and Gorrel spent all that day indoors, and they pitied those whose business required them to venture outside. They kept the fire burning all day to keep the house warm. The next day came, and still the rain poured. The wood box was nearly empty. Running out of firewood would be highly undesirable in such cold weather. Luckily, they did still have a good stack of it by the side of the house. Unfortunately, that was outside, in the rain. One of them would have to go out and get some. Rattle opted to go. He took one step out the door, and instantly he was soaked. His clothing was wet through, and water poured in rivulets through his hair. Fortunately, the woodpile was only a few feet away from the door, but even so, Rattle was freezing by the time he had made 5 or 6 trips back and forth, carrying the logs inside and stacking them in front of the fire, so that they could hopefully dry out enough by the time they were needed. Then Rattle himself sat by the fireplace, after changing into some dry clothes, trying to regain warmth. That night the wind again picked up, whipping through the village and shaking the house. There was some distant thunder again, too, though nowhere near as much as earlier. At first, Rattle wasn't sure what had woken him. It was quite early in the morning, and not a sound could be heard, and yet something seemed unusual, but he could not put his finger on what it was. And then he realized not a sound could be heard. The rain had stopped! He quickly dressed and ran outside to see for himself. Indeed, the sky was clear, barely a cloud could be seen, and the air was still. All around, the earth was squelchy underfoot, still soaked from the rain, and the stone-paved roads were coated in muddy residue that had washed over them in the downpour, but the air was clear, and the rays of the rising sun were warm on Rattle's face. He trotted down the street, heading towards the beach. As he approached, he saw there seemed to be some sort of commotion down on the shore. Several people were standing about, talking with some excitement. They seemed to be looking at something further south, down the shore. Rattle glanced in that direction. The rocky headland extended out into the water. More people were out there, examining something that seemed to be resting on the point. Rattle squinted, trying to discern what it was. It appeared to be a pile of timber. Almost like a giant seagull's nest it looked. He ran closer to investigate. The nearer he drew, the more clearly he saw it. It was a heap of wood all right, but there seemed to be little thought to its arrangement. Planks and beams protruded from odd angles, placed seemingly at random, though in several spots there appeared to be sections where boards were attached beside one another, forming a sheet of wood. Rattle reached the first few rocks and climbed upon them, still approaching the site. He saw now that among the timbers there are other things too, scraps of metal and shreds of cloth, and around all there seemed to be draped many ropes, like wads of spaghetti. Then something caught his eye, something that shone and glinted in the sunlight. It was quite close to him. It was a board which must have separated from the rest of the wreckage, for it had lodged amongst the rocks some distance from its companions. It shone because it was gilt upon one surface. Rattle turned it over for a better look. His heart froze. Engraved upon the gilded surface in large letters were 2 words: Ocean Rider. The dishevelled pile of planking was the ruins of the returning vessel. Now that he knew what he was looking at, he saw it more clearly. She had slammed head first into the headland, beaching herself upon the rocks. She was torn in half, her stern end sunk back into the water, shattered by the waves pounding her against the rocks, her prow resting grimly higher upon the shore. Her 2 masts had toppled, and the remains of her sails hung in shreds, whilst her rigging had tangled all over. There she lay like a mangled whale carcass, fragmented in 100 places, timbers askew, crumpled upon the headland as though she had been crushed by a giant fist and discarded upon the shore. Rattle's mind was reeling with panic. His father had been on that ship, along with several others he knew from town. What had happened to them? Evidently, the storm that had shaken the village had shown no mercy out upon the waves. Men were searching through the wreckage, looking for survivors. Rattle staggered closer, barely able to think. One of the men spied him approaching, and recognizing him, went out to meet him. Rattle opened his mouth, but could find neither the breath to speak, nor the presence of mind to formulate his question, so great was the shock he was in. But the man seemed to understand. "We found no living," he began. Rattle turned and fled before he could finish speaking. "Wait!" he called after the retreating figure, but Rattle was impervious to all. He heard nothing and felt nothing as he ran, his mind so clogged that no thoughts could flow through it. All had been reduced to boiling, seething emotions. He ran, the tears swept away from his face by the rushing of the breeze he made. He ran, far away from that dreadful shore, away from the town. He ran up into the hills, to a quiet place where he could be alone with his grief, where perhaps his tears would wash his pain away and make him forget his sorrow, or perhaps he would awaken from the terrible nightmare he had been plunged into. Coming to a secluded hollow, he collapsed to the ground by a solitary tree, buried his face in his hands, and wept bitterly. A lone fox came upon him some time later. Normally shy and wary of humans, this one crept up to the edge of the hollow, looking curiously at the pitiful figure. It sniffed the air cautiously, wondering what to make of this strange creature lying face down on the ground. Then it bounded away, its curiosity satisfied, yet still unknowing of the matter. After many hours, Rattle could cry no more. His sorrow had not lessened, yet it had settled into a calmer, deeper sadness not suited to tears. His mind had cleared too, his thoughts now ran fluently, yet there were thoughts still of the uttermost gloom. He raised his head, only to find he had a splitting headache. Again his head drooped. But eventually he gathered his strength and managed to get himself upright. Holding one hand across his face, the pressure upon his forehead eased the pain somewhat. Squinting his brows hard also helped a little, and carefully he tottered back towards town. He managed at last to make it back home, unaccosted, happily, for he could not bear to try to converse with anybody. Not only did his head feel as if someone had hammered a nail into it, but also had begun to feel dizzy and sick. He crashed onto his bed, pressing his face hard into the pillow, his head throbbing, and closed his eyes. He dozed for about an hour, then he stirred a little. He realized he was quite thirsty, yet he hardly felt he could manage to get up and fetch a drink. Then he noticed a cup on the table by his bed, a cup filled with pure, bright, clear, refreshing water. He did not ponder how it had got there, he just accepted it as fact, though presumably some kind soul, observing his condition, had thoughtfully placed it there, knowing that it would be desired greatly. Rattle took a sip. Though he felt that he was dying of thirst, one sip was all his mouth and stomach could manage. A strange bitter flavour it seemed to have, for he had not eaten all day. He rested his head a few more seconds, and then took another sip. After drinking about half of the cup in this manner, he settled back down, and went back to sleep.